Namaste, everyone, and welcome to your course on predicting major life events. This is the first time that I'm presenting this course online, and I'm quite excited about it. Today, I'm not going to be presenting on how to predict any one event. This is coming later. Today, I'm going to be introducing the topic, discussing the methodology that we're going to be using, and also discussing some issues related to that. And so I want to begin that by starting out by saying that I was very privileged to spend a lot of individual time with my Jyotish guru, K.N. Rao, back in the 1990s when I first met him, starting in November of 1993. I spent a lot of time in his classroom, but also individually because I hosted him on a couple occasions in the San Diego area in which I live. And then when he stopped coming to the U.S., I also then went to India and spent time with him individually. And when I did so, I was had the ability or had the good fortune of being able to sit in to a number of consultations that he gave. And it was incredibly awe-inspiring in the sense that he just was a phenomenal predictor. His approach to doing charts was always to start out by tracing some events in a person's life that served two purposes. One, he was verifying that the birth chart that he was working with, and actually the divisional charts also, were correct. And then also, it's also served the purpose, of course, if he was able to do that, it established some really strong credibility with the person that was consulting with him. And he could do this at times with a degree of specificity that was amazing. I remember sitting in with him for about 5 or 6 consultations in a row. One woman, he pinpointed a time in their life when they'd been in a relationship, not just in a relationship, but he mentioned you were in a relationship with a drug dealer who then was subsequently went to jail. This is what I mean when I say with a high degree of specificity. A friend of mine who I had arranged a consultation with came in, and Mr. Rao started off the conversation by saying, you've come to me to consult about a lawsuit that you're involved in related to professional malpractice. And my friend's jaw literally dropped open because that was exactly the case. I can remember another woman where he mentioned that you live on a property where you have a lot of fruit trees. And she acknowledged that she did. She owned a large home next to which was an orange orchard. So this is what I mean when I say that he was a phenomenal predictor. Now he stopped coming to the U.S. starting in I think 96. Fast forward to I'm sorry, maybe that was 95. Fast forward to a year after that. And I took a leave of absence from my corporate job at the position and went and spent 6 weeks with him in India, living in the condominium complex where he lived and being with him every day. And therefore, again, got to observe a number of consultations. It was much more informal in India. People would just drop by at all hours seeking a consultation. Some people were coming by just to say hello and to thank him for successful predictions that that were given to him in the past. And towards the end of that trip, he took me individually on a tour of some sacred sites in India, places like Vrindavan, the birthplace of Lord Krishna. And one evening, I can remember we were having dinner, and I confessed to him my ambition to become a good, successful predictor like him. And the first thing he said, which was kind of both surprising and a little bit discouraging, was that he mentioned that a good predictive astrologer was, he estimated, 1 in 20,000. I don't know if that was typical exaggeration or whether he actually meant that. And then he went on to say that you can know a lot about Jyotish and still not be able to predict. He cited the example of someone in his school who had finished number 1 in their class, had gone on to become a member of their faculty, and had even now then published some books, but he really was not a very good predictor, at least at that time. He may have become so. And so, I asked him what his advice was as to how I could become a good predictor, and some of you maybe have heard this from him before. He mentioned that I should work on in a 10-year period on thousands of charts and noting the correlation between a person's life experience and their birth chart and also the timing of events. And through that saturated experience, I would become a good predictor. Well, I did that. It's now, what, 23, 25 years later, and I still can't predict like he predicted. But in all modesty, I have been able to predict a certain limited number of events with a good deal of consistent success. You know, I came to understand that his ability to predict was more than just astrological analysis. He, I believe, had very well developed intuitive abilities, I think maybe resulting from his, intense spiritual practices. And this enabled him to see things that, normal astrologer wouldn't be able to see, or to look at a particular combination and know exactly what it meant in that person's life versus the various things that it could have meant. And, I kind of think I see some of this in his birth chart. I'm going to pause for a moment and bring up his birth chart. You should now be seeing that in a document. And, the two planets, of course, that are most associated with astrology and astrological ability would be Mercury and Jupiter. And you'll note that in his chart, both are in their exaltation signs. Actually, it was in his Mercury Mahadasha in the 12th house as the 12th Lord that he then started going abroad, first to the US and then later to Russia, to teach Jyotish. And it was during this period that, I spent my time with him and was sitting in on consultations and so on. But you'll notice here that, Mercury is not only the 9th and the 12th Lord exalted in the 12th, but it's also with Ketu, which is, I believe, one of the astrological indications in the chart that he had this very powerful, well-developed intuitive abilities to go along with his astrological knowledge. When people would come out of consultations with K.N. Rao and say, this man must be a psychic, I kind of felt that way myself when I first had a consultation with him. And he used to find this amusing because he was aware, number one, that, he was doing it. All of his predictions had an astrological basis, but I think then added to that were the intuitive powers. So actually, after being involved in Jyotish for about 10 years, I got a little discouraged, thinking that I was never going to be the kind of predictor that he was, because it just didn't have to do with how much I studied or how much of the Shastra I had absorbed, and actually started focusing on some other things. But then later came back to Jyotish, and that was in 2012. And since then have been given quite a few predictions that the people who I gave them to and some of my students will verify have been able to come out, but in a much more limited way. I've focused on the type of events that we're going to be looking at here, type of events what I'd call major life events. So, what I want to talk about first is, the whole question of what is the methodology that he taught. Now, I've described it as a rather sophisticated and complex methodology, and here I outline it. And this is a methodology that I'm going to be teaching in this course, and we're going to be utilizing. You're going to be learning how to apply it, but it involves a number of factors. First of all and foremost, it involves the simultaneous use of both the Parashari and the Jaimini system. The advantage of this is that, of course, the two systems are a completely different way of looking at a birth chart, of analyzing it for static potentials, but also for dynamic potentials. And so the advantage of knowing both is that you can examine a time period in both, and if both systems are indicating the static potential and then the dynamic activation of that potential in a certain time period simultaneously, well, this enables you to feel that you're on safer ground and you're actually seeing some event correctly. And so this is a major part of his approach and methodology that we'll be using here. The other thing is that there's the extensive use of alternative lagnas, both in the Parashari system and also in the Jaimini system. And yes, this makes things more complex. But, as I'm going to show some examples of here, unless you use certain alternative lagnas, that you're not going to be able to see the potentials of a certain event happening at a particular time. Now, there's also the extensive use of divisional charts, of which, I think K.N. Rao was someone who kind of single-handedly in India, along with another man, Seshadri, sort of revived the important use of these. As we'll go on to talk about, they're kind of double-edged sword in the sense that the lagnas of divisional charts are very sensitive, of course, to even minor inaccuracies in the birth time. So there's always this question of whether you're working with a birth time that gives a accurate set of divisional charts. More about this later. And so another point here that's a part of this methodology we'll be looking at is the application of multiple dashas when timing an event. K.N. Rao, I saw him use up to 4, sometimes 5 dashas when really trying to zero in on an event in the close timing of it. And then, of course, you have planetary dashas in the Parashari system, and we're going to be looking at 2 of those, Vimshotri, but then also one called Yogini, which is a much shorter cycle, a 36-year cycle. And then there are, of course, many sign-based dashas in Jaimini. We are going to be using at a minimum 2 of them, more at times. One being, of course, Chara, which is the main all-purpose dasha, but then others as well. And then finally, in order to predict, you have to apply the use of transits and the qualification of these using the Astaka Varga system. It's the coordination of timing with dashas and along with transits that then precipitates an event. You can be running dashas that may have an eligibility for bringing an event, but then the transits aren't going to be right. And vice versa, you can be running transits that support a certain event, but not dashas. We're looking at times when these 2 coordinate, again, all supporting the idea of a particular event happening at a particular time. Now, this may seem complicated, and it is, but, if you take it a step at a time, I think anyone can learn how to do this, though it may take a little time to master it. But before, I say any more about the methodology, it's worthwhile to examine some of the reasons that it's a challenge, what makes it difficult. And it's something that I just mentioned previously is probably the chief culprit, and that is inaccurate birth times. I like to refer to these as the bane of an astrologer's existence, because successful prediction using many of the techniques we're looking at, particularly the technique of using divisional charts, is, of course, very dependent on accurate birth times. And so this is a problem. It's also the problem, another difficulty in predicting is the way in which events can show up in just a bewildering number of ways. A recent example of this sort of came to mind with a student that I'm tutoring, and he had been approached by a publishing firm to write a book in his area of expertise, which he then did accomplish in a matter of months and got published. And he was a relatively new student of Jyotish, and he was perplexed as to how this could have been seen or could have been predicted on his birth chart in the major period of Jupiter and the 7th period of Mercury. I think he might have been perplexed because he was looking for these planets to be connected to houses of authorship, and they weren't in particular. When I heard that he had written the book in Jupiter Mercury, it was completely obvious to me because I'd actually written a long article researching the astrology of authorship and starting out with the idea that the 2 planets who are planetary indicators of authorship are Jupiter and Mercury, and that many famous authors had actually written their masterpieces in either Jupiter Mercury or Mercury Jupiter. This is a principle, actually, that is the very first principle about interpreting the results of dashas that's given in Parashara Hora on the chapter entitled The Effects of Dasha. You can see, I'm quoting it here, it says there are 2 kinds of the effects of dashas, general and distinctive. The natural characteristics of the planets cause the general effects, That's why he could author in Jupiter Mercury. That would be an example of that. And then the distinctive effects are realized by their individual disposition in the chart. That is, where they're placed, what houses that they rule, yogas that they form, aspects that they make and aspects they receive. That's all encompassed by this idea of what's referred to as the distinctive effects. Actually, the distinctive effects indicate what he wrote a book about. This man is a practitioner of traditional Chinese medicine, which, the approach is healing through acupuncture and through herbs. Apparently he has expertise as a Chinese medical herbalist, and this is what he wrote the book about. You can see that his 10th Lord, Jupiter, which is the major period that he's running, falls in the 6th house, having to do with the healing arts. Mercury, who actually is the Lagna Lord, well placed in its own sign here, is with Mars, who's the 6th Lord. So he ends up writing a book about medicinal arts, herbology, in his Jupiter Mercury period. Authorship, because it's Jupiter and Mercury, the topic that he wrote on is indicated by the distinctive indications of these two planets in his chart. And by the way, just parenthetically, he's also an extremely serious student of Jyotish at the moment, which is, again, indicated primarily by just the natural significations of Jupiter and Mercury being the two planets that are indicators of astrology, as I mentioned earlier. So another way that events can show up, of course, is, continuing on, actually, with this idea that planets will give the results based on their natural significations. I'm showing you the chart here of a woman who I predicted marriage for, even though she was approaching 70 years of age, which, the statistics of a woman here in the U.S. that age marrying are, almost astronomical. And I actually made the prediction when she was running her major period of Venus. And as you can see, Venus is not particularly well situated here in her chart at all, and it really has nothing to do with the 7th house or the 7th Lord. It's placed in the 6th house here. It's in a mutual exchange with Mars, who also aspects it, and it's also aspected by Saturn. So this might fall under the category of risky prediction. But when I saw that she was going to be running her Venus-Rahu period, I saw that based on this and on placements in Navamsha, it did become eligible for bringing a major love affair into her life that I saw potentially leading to marriage, because the period just after Venus-Rahu was going to be Venus-Jupiter. And in this case, based on its distinctive features, Jupiter can bring marriage because it's the 7th Lord. It's aspecting, it's this planet ruling the 7th house, and it's also aspecting its own 7th house. And she did, in fact, have a love affair come into her life, and she actually then married in Venus-Jupiter. So it's another illustration of, at least in terms of the major period Lord, giving its effects just based on its natural significations. One more example of that. This is a chart of an individual that who I predicted the birth of a child in May of this year, and then she ended up having a child exactly on May 29th, 2019, I should say. And you can see here Jupiter is not really related, well, it actually makes aspects onto the Mars, who is the 5th Lord, but really I saw Jupiter as being eligible for giving this event, not so much based on that, because it's Jupiter. Jupiter being a natural indicator of children. Now, the sub-period in which I timed the event to was that of Rahu, who, because of its distinctive features, meaning it's placed here in the 5th house, was obviously eligible for bringing this event. So another thing that makes Jyotish complicated in terms of being able to make predictions is the fact that sometimes events don't show up from the birth logna very well at all. And I'm going to be using my own chart here to illustrate what I'm talking about. Focus in on my Mars. I ran my Mars period from age 17 to 24. And, based on its distinctive condition and features here in the chart, some of the things that and indications that happened during that period are very apparent. First of all, I was very involved in sports and playing sports, particularly basketball. And you can see here that Mars rules the third house. And of course, Mars as a natural significator of competitive activities. But it's the Lord of the third house of sports, too. But you can see that it's in the eighth house, it's the eighth Lord with the Lagna Lord, forming an Arishta Yoga. And right in the major period of Mars and subperiod of Mercury, I tore ligaments and cartilage in my knee playing basketball that necessitated an operation, which would be an eighth house signification. And of course, Mercury rules the 10th house, which pertains to the knees. But also because I was laid up for quite a bit of time as I was healing from that injury, I had a lot of time to read and found myself attracted to reading rather esoteric things. I can remember reading the case studies of Edgar Cayce and getting very interested in the idea of reincarnation. And also the works of Carl Jung, depth psychology, these being again indications of the eighth house. And later on in the period, I started doing yoga asana, which is again ruled by the third house, and then started doing some other aspects of yoga sadhana, such as pranayama and meditation, that then led to a very powerful inner experience having to do with the awakening of Kundalini, which is again another eighth house signification. So the point I'm saying here is that Mars clearly gave its results based on its lordship of the third, its placement in the eighth. But at the same time, these were key educational years for me, the last 2 years of high school and the first, all of college. So, I did reasonably well, even though I was something of a lazy student. So I'm achieving educationally, got a degree during this time. I also met my first guru, Goswami Kriyananda of Chicago, started studying in his yoga seminary, where we were studying all the major religions of the world. And so things like higher achievement and higher education, gurus, religion, these are all significations of the ninth house. How could that be seen in Mars? Well, if you use the moon, Chandra Lagna, as the first house, Leo as the first house, well then now Mars becomes the ninth lord in the ninth house, actually with the first lord, and then it becomes clear how the Mars major period could also bring these indications. Again, the point being that unless we examine a major period lord from Chandra Lagna, we are likely to miss some of the implications of what a major period could bring and what it becomes eligible for. This is a chart that I made a prediction on. This was back in the end of 2017. This is a woman who has enjoyed a pretty good career life, rising up in her area and becoming in a significant executive managerial position. And this has all happened in the Jupiter major period, which may not be that obvious unless you knew some more subtle distinctions about what kind of results Jupiter gives here, but becomes rather perfectly obvious if you see Jupiter's position from the moon. And note here that it's a strong Chandra Lagna in the sense that the moon is in its exaltation sign. And you'll see that Jupiter falls 10th from there, giving, of course, a Kesari yoga, a good yoga for becoming, for giving status. And so again, this is an example of that. If you don't see Jupiter from the moon, it's much more difficult to see how, number one, there was a career focus in her life and has been throughout the Jupiter major period. And secondarily, how it gives her career rise in the Jupiter major period. Now, many of you who follow the news are probably aware that Prince Harry had married recently. I think he married in May of 2018. And then just recently, he and his wife, Meghan, have given birth to their first child. This was just last May of 2019. Now, when I saw that he married, and it's not something I had predicted, and when I saw that he married, I did get, and I saw that the chart of his wife was available, I did get interested in thinking about when they might have a child. And given the fact that they were both in their mid-30s, I suspected they would at least want to have a child fairly soon after that. So I was looking at, the upcoming periods and saw that Prince Harry was going to be moving into the major period of Rahu and the sub-period of Venus. Now, take a look at this chart, and do you see any eligibility for Rahu giving this kind of result, that is, bringing a child? It does, actually, because it gets aspected by the fifth lord Mars. We know that the nodes Rahu and Ketu will give the results based on the planets they're most connected with, and also the lord of the sign that they're in. In this case, Rahu gets the aspect of Mars, the fifth lord, so that's clear enough. But then why the sub-period of Venus? If you examine Venus here, you won't really see its connection to the fifth house or the fifth lord from any of the normal lagnas that you might use, that is from the birth lagna, from the moon, or even from what's called Karaka lagna, the position of Jupiter, which is the same here as the birth lagna. So why the sub-period of Venus? Well, when I looked at the fact that he was going to be running Rahu Venus, it became perfectly apparent to me that this period and sub-period could give this result. Why? Because of this idea of what's called Dasha Lagna, that is using the major period lord and its position as a Lagna and seeing the patterning of the chart from there. So if we put our finger on Taurus, make that the Lagna, Venus goes to the fifth from there. And through my experience and through classical principles in Jyotish, I'm well aware that this then becomes a very eligible period for bringing this event. Of course, Rahu Venus is a fairly long period. And so, if you want to make a more precise prediction, you have to start working other ways. But the other ways in which I worked is what I mentioned earlier, this composite technique. I wanted to see with Chara Dasha, the main sign-based Dasha of the Jaimini system, whether it also showed childbirth in the same time frame. Now, the advantage of working with something like the sign-based dashas of Jaimini is that they encompass much smaller periods of time. The most that a major period can be is 12 years, and the most that a sub-period can be is 1 year. Now, what I saw when I looked at Prince Henry's chart is that he was, I'm not showing Caracas here, but I saw that he was running the sub-period, the major period of Libra. And in the Jaimini system, we use these special karakas, that is, planets who take on a special signification based on their degrees. And in this case, Saturn is the planet with the fifth highest degrees, excluding Rahu and Ketu. It becomes what's called the Putra Karaka, or the PK, the natural significator of children. And so he was running his Libra major period, and then Libra I saw mid this year. And so this period and sub-period was very attractive to me as far as seeing one that could give the event, and it turns out that it did. Now, I also had his wife's chart. His wife's chart here. Goodness, is not showing up. Well, we'll come back to this because I thought I had it here, but I don't. What I was showing here is the way in which Rahu Venus become eligible for giving this birth of a child because of the idea of Dasha Lagna, that is Venus falling in the fifth house from Rahu. And another example of this, I can remember when I first started studying Jyotish, of course, like a lot of people, I was taking my life events, and I was seeing when they were timed as far as the Nakshotri Dasha and trying to understand the way in which certain periods gave certain events. Now, I had noticed that when I was running my Rahu Moon period, that this period and sub-period had brought a major relationship into my life. But I was very perplexed by this because, if you look at the placement and rulership of these planets, they really don't have anything to do with the seventh house of the seventh lord of the birth chart. But at that time, I was not familiar with the principle of Dasha Lagna or even Chandra Lagna. You can see that Rahu is falling in the seventh house. from Chandra Lagna. Therefore, it becomes eligible for giving this kind of event. And then if you use Dasha Lagna, that is the place of Rahu, as a Lagna, you'll see that the moon falls in the 7th house from there. And this is why, according to principles of Jyotish, this event could have been predictable in that period and sub-period. So what makes predicting complex and difficult is the various ways, as I'm talking about here, that events can show up. Now, not only do they show up from alternative lagnas or because of the natural significations of planets, but sometimes they're not apparent in the birth chart at all, but are only apparent and primarily only predictable based on a particular divisional chart. I'm showing you a chart of a woman who, this would have been back in the later to mid-90s. I had predicted a relationship for her, potentially leading to marriage, in the major period of the moon and the sub-period of Ketu. Now, if you look at in the Rashi, moon and Ketu, the moon is the Lagna lord in the 4th house, getting directional strength. It's a Lagna lord, so it counts as a trine lord, and therefore being with Ketu, who here will now serve as an angle lord, it does form a what's called a nodal Raja Yoga in the 4th house. And so you'd expect that in Moon Ketu, some events related to the 4th house, potential acquisition of property, that would be more along the lines you'd be thinking when it comes to this period and sub-period. And as a matter of fact, I did mention that, and as it turned out, she did purchase a home in her Moon Ketu period. But what she was interested in, because she had divorced and was interested in getting remarried, was relationship potentials. And I told her that the relationship potentials for the Moon Ketu period were actually quite good as long as her Navamsha Lagna was correct. Because if I show you Navamsha here, you'll see that in her D9, Moon and Ketu are together in the 7th house, followed by Moon Mars, when Mars becomes the 7th lord here. So, but I told her that it was contingent upon the accuracy of her birth time. The reason being is that if you look at the degree of the Lagna in the birth chart, 10 degrees 4 minutes, and you know the dividing line between the 3rd and 4th Navamsha, which is 10 degrees, you can see it's right on the edge, which means had her actual time of birth been just a minute or so before, Navamsha Lagna would change, and this idea of the Moon Ketu in the 7th house of her D9 would go away. Fortunately, the birth time did turn out to be accurate enough to give a correct Navamsha. A major relationship did come into her life in Moon Ketu, and then she married in the subsequent period of Moon Mars. And I'm timing this purely on the basis of her Navamsha, where the Moon and Ketu are together in the 7th, and Mars is the ruler. Here's the chart of a man who shortly married right after he moved into his Venus major period, something that becomes rather obvious based on the birth log, because Venus, as you can see here, is the 7th lord. But this man also had 4 children in the major period of Venus, which again is really not that apparent from the Rashi at all. It's not connected to the 5th house of the 5th lord, either from the birth lagna or from the moon. Now, if you were a more sophisticated practitioner, you might notice that it is the planet who rules the 5th house from what's called Karaka Lagna. Karaka of children is, of course, Jupiter. So if we use the position of Jupiter here in Gemini, the 5th house from there becomes Libra, ruled by Venus. But, this is hindsight, and I doubt if I or most astrologers would be thinking along the lines of, children, with Venus giving children. However, I'm going to show you here Venus position in D7, the divisional chart having to do with the predicting children, and then you'll see that it becomes rather obvious because Venus here is right there in the Lagna of a divisional chart. One of the principles that those of you who have studied with me may know, and certainly one we're going to be focused on here in this course, is that when a planet is in the Lagna of a particular divisional chart, it has a very special eligibility for bringing events related to that particular division. That's going to be particularly so when it's the Lagna Lord in the Lagna, like we have here. And so, you know, if I was examining the potentials of the Venus Mahadasha, one of the things I'd be doing is tracing its placement in some of the key divisional charts and seeing that, especially at the age that he was, 24, and knowing that he had recently married, it would have been a very logical prediction to suggest, wow, you know, you're going to have some children in the Venus major period. Of course, that period is 20 years, so it would mean looking at timing subperiods, which is something we're going to be learning about, you know, as well. So again, along these lines, the same theme of events really not showing up hardly at all in a birth chart, but showing up well in a divisional chart. You're looking at the chart here of a young man who has had a very good educational career during his high school years, followed by his college years. And just this last month, he graduated with honors from a rather prestigious university here in the US. Now, educational achievement is one of the events that we're going to be looking at. And when I share with you the parameters to apply to the birth chart, you wouldn't necessarily see either the moon period here, who is the third lord and the sixth, or the Mars period, who's the Lagna and is the, I'm sorry, the Mars is the third and the 10th lord in the 8th house. With the additional influence of natural malefics, you wouldn't necessarily see these two major periods as being one that are going to give this kind of educational success. But of course, many of you are aware that when looking at such matters, we want to be consulting the divisional chart, the Siddhamsha, sometimes referred to as the Shaptura Vimshamsha, which is D24. Now, the difficulty with using such a divisional chart is that even minor inaccuracies of the birth time are going to potentially not give a correct D24 Lagna. This birth time was a recorded time, and it gives originally a D24 Lagna that was Pisces. But, you know, given what has happened, both in his moon period and his Mars period, given the fact that it would take just a very minor adjustment to the birth time to give an Aquarius D24 Lagna, I can say with a fairly high degree of certainty that his D24 Lagna is actually Aquarius, in which case the two periods of major educational achievement, the Moon and Mars period, both would be placed here in the first house. And, you know, there's more to it than that. They would also, independently of whether they've fallen to Lagna or not, although I strongly believe they do, they're getting the additional aspect of the natural benefic Venus. The moon here is involved in a good Gajikesari yoga. And if you take house lordships, which my Jyotish Guru did in divisional charts, the Mars-Venus combination here is a very good angle trine combination with Venus as the Yoga Karaka planet and Mars as the 10th lord here. So, you know, just based on the birth chart, it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to see educational achievement during this time. I believe based on the Siddhamsha using Aquarius Lagna, it would be very clear if you understood certain principles for interpreting, you know, divisional charts. So, summarizing what I've, you know, talked about so far, events can be seen based on the natural significations of planets. They can be seen based on using alternative lagnas, such as Chandra Lagna, Dasha Lagna, and as we'll see, even Karaka Lagna, and then based on divisional charts. You know, it's even goes beyond that in the sense that there are some more subtle ways that events can show up in the birth chart that I have written about. Some of you have read my article, Udu's Clue, which is all about how the nakshatra placement of a particular major period lord and what planet rules that nakshatra and the kind of results it gives can give a very vital clue to some of what the major period can bring. I'm showing you here the chart of a famous comic actor, Chris Farley, who actually died tragically of a drug overdose in his early 30s, but he initially came to fame in his Mercury major period. Now, the fact that he might be performing during this time is pretty clear in the sense that Mercury is the third lord here, and it's also involved in a good Saraswati yoga. But Saraswati yoga, even though it will incline you towards artistic self-expression, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be hugely successful at it the way he did. The combinations in his chart that show the potential for great success and wealth resulting from that are actually the combination of the planets up into his ninth house, which is the Moon, Jupiter, and Venus. They're forming multiple, both Raja and Dan yogas, as well as Kesari yoga. But the fame didn't come in any of these periods. It came in Mercury, and we have to understand sort of how that could have been seen just on the Rashi. Now, if you look at the degrees of Mercury, 1358, you'll see that it's in the moon's nakshatra Shravana. And so according to this principle, Mercury was giving to some degree the results of the Raja and Dan yoga planets forming in the ninth house there. And then it was in the sub-period of Venus, a part of that configuration, exalted here, that he was originally invited to join the cast of Saturday Night Live, which then led him to his, fame and fortune, you might say, potentially his downfall too. So my point about this is that I've illustrated different ways in which events can show up, and that makes predicting challenging because then so many periods become eligible for bringing events, right? And this is why Kane Rao really advocated the use of the composite technique that I mentioned earlier. How do you distinguish between so many periods that might become eligible for bringing an event and ones that actually will? And the only answer that I have for that is by using this composite technique and by using multiple dashas in connection with transits. So when you see that both the Parashari system and the Jaimini system show the potential for an event in a certain time period, and they do so, using multiple dashas, and then additionally that the transits support that event, this is the way you can narrow things down and separate so many periods that might become eligible for bringing an event for ones that, actually do. So this was the chart I was looking for earlier, the chart of Meghan Markle, right? And she married the prince in the major period of Jupiter and the sub-period of Saturn, which is, again, in this case, just rather obvious from the birth chart in the sense that, Jupiter here is the seventh lord from the moon. It's with the seventh lord Saturn, and then, of course, the marriage took place in the sub-period of Saturn itself. But when I was thinking about the birth of children, after having examined Prince Harry's chart, I saw that the Jupiter-Saturn period, which he would continue to run, also brought a strong eligibility for bringing a child as well. Why? A couple reasons here. Jupiter, again, is just the natural significator of children. It can bring that regardless of its placement in the birth chart. Here it's also the ninth lord, which, as we're going to see, being fifth from the fifth, gives it additional eligibility. But why the sub-period of Saturn, right? And the answer here is that if you apply the Chandra Lagna, position of the moon, Saturn rules the fifth from there. It's with Karaka Jupiter. And even if you're using what's called Dasha Lagna, again, that is the placement of the major period lord Jupiter in Virgo, Saturn again becomes the fifth lord. And so then it becomes a matter of looking at sub periods, right? And in this case, the sub period of the moon that's connected to these planets that show the potential of bringing children really caught my eye. And it turns out that she ended up giving birth during that, but I would not have made that prediction just based on just the one system. I was also looking at the Jaimini system, in which case I saw that she was running the major period of Sagittarius Now, what makes Sagittarius eligible here from a point of Gemini is the fact that it receives the Rashi Drishti, the sign aspect, both from Jupiter, the natural significator of children, but then also Saturn, who is the PK of her chart. And I saw that in 2019, she was either going to be running Pisces in the early part of the year, which would also get these aspects, but then she would be moving into Aquarius starting in early May. And from Aquarius, and again, the idea here is to use Aquarius as if it were the Lagna and see the fifth house and the fifth lord from there, what's going on that way. And if you use Aquarius as a Lagna, the fifth from there becomes Gemini, which then also receives the aspect of Karaka, Jupiter, and the PK. So but between this period of Indian Shotri, Jupiter, Saturn, Moon, if I'm remembering correctly here, I'm going from memory, and then also combining with the major period and sub-period of Sagittarius, Aquarius, it looked as if she was going to be giving birth in mid this year, and she gave birth in May of 2019. Now, consider transits. First of all, consider transits back in the chart of Prince Harry. What we're looking for in this case, it gets more complex than this because we're going to be using more than just Jupiter and Saturn when we learn how to time the birth of children. But we start with the slower moving planets, Jupiter and Saturn. And some of you who have studied with me know that I use a principle taught to me by K and Rao, where we're trying to see if there is the double influence simultaneously of both Jupiter and Saturn on the fifth house or the fifth lord. That can also be extended with children to the ninth house or the ninth lord. Another thing you have to bear in mind there is that he uses this thing which he already referred to as a Brigu principle, where if a planet is retrograde, it's aspecting also from the sign previously. So, Jupiter at the time when his son was born, of course, was in Scorpio, in which case it would be right on his fifth lord, right? And Saturn retrograde in Sagittarius would also, according to this quote Brigu principle, also be affecting Mars, the fifth lord. In the case of Meghan Markle, right, then the fifth lord here is Mars, right? And so, of course, Saturn from there, from Sagittarius, that is, would have been affecting Mars there, but then Jupiter actually moved over within a certain period of time into Sagittarius, also aspecting, but then Jupiter is moving in the fifth house itself as well. So what I'm showing you here is something that we're going to be employing over and over again when we're trying to zero in on periods of big events. Meaning we're going to see that in both the Gemini system and the Parashara system, the person is running periods that create an eligibility for bringing that event and within the same time frame. And then also, in addition to that, we're going to be applying this double transit of Saturn-Jupiter to the house in question, or the house lord in question. But then you'll also see we're going to be using the transits of faster-moving grahas as well to time that more specifically. So this is the methodology that I referred to. I called it a rather sophisticated and complex methodology, but I've also found it to be one that, if applied judiciously and intelligently, can enable you to successfully predict. So now I'd like to talk about and sort of further illustrate this methodology, again related to a prediction that, I didn't give the prediction about the birth of the child of Prince Harry and Meghan publicly. It's just something I did privately on my own. You'll have to take my word for that. But I also would like to talk about a prediction I made that can be verified from the person that I gave it to. And it had to do with an individual whose chart I'm showing you here, who back in 2016 had just moved into his Jupiter major period. And before we go any further, kind of just look at, say, Jupiter here and think to yourself about some of the potentials it might hold favorably and why. You should see that Jupiter here is pretty well placed. It's the fifth lord in the first. It's combining with a Vargotama Lagna Lord Sun, so that's a good 1-5 Raja Yoga. Mercury's presence here as the second and 11th lord with the fifth and first lord make some Dhan Yoga combinations, right? All the planets have a source of strength. The sun is both in its own sign in Vargotama. Mercury gets directional strength. Jupiter is getting also directional strength. So a fairly favorable picture. Take a look further at the chart and ask yourself the question, does anything spoil this picture? The answer, unfortunately, is yes. Most of you maybe would have noticed that Rahu and Saturn flank. They're hemming. There's Papakatara Yoga here. The two natural malefics, Rahu and Saturn, on both sides of the first house, which is a significant blemish, but doesn't mean that these yogas won't give some of their fruit. And he actually relatively soon was anticipating some of that fruit, in the sense that you see Jupiter here is also the eighth lord. His father had passed away, and he was in line for an inheritance. It was going to apparently take a while. He didn't know exactly when he was going to get it. And actually what his question to me was he wanted to know when he'd be able to get the inheritance, but connected that when he would therefore be able to purchase property. That was his intention when he got the inheritance. He wanted to purchase property. He was married. He had a couple of children. They wanted to buy a home. And so this was the question. And therefore, we have to ask ourselves, first of all, does Jupiter as a major period show any eligibility for bringing such an event as the acquisition of property? Well, from the birth lagna, it really doesn't. But if you use the position of a strong Chandra lagna here, the moon and its exaltation sign Taurus, you'll see that all the planets in Leo fall in the fourth house from there, including Jupiter. So it would actually be Jupiter in the fourth house from the moon with the fourth lord sun. That certainly shows some eligibility, but my next step was actually to look at the divisional chart related to this affairs, which would be D4, the Chaturshramsha, and there it became very clear that Jupiter was going to bring property. Why? Something I mentioned earlier, that any planets in the lagna of a particular divisional chart show a special eligibility for bringing that. That's what we see here. That's going to be particularly so if this graha has sources of strength. You'll see Jupiter does here. It also gets directional strength, and there's additional strength resulting from an exchange with Venus, an exalted lagna lord of this division. But Jupiter's 16 years. And so what he wanted to know, what's the earliest that it could potentially bring property? Well, it could have come in Jupiter, but based on what he had told me, that seemed a little early. So I was looking at the next sub-period, which would be Saturn. And if we go back to the birth chart, you'll see here that Saturn aspects onto the fourth house. So it has some relationship to both the fourth house of the birth chart. But what I based this thinking on more was that Saturn here, you'll see it's in the same sign in the D4 as it is in the birth chart, meaning it's Vargotama. It gets aspected by Jupiter from the lagna. It also gets aspected by a exalted Venus, who's the lagna lord. And one of the principles that we're going to be talking about is that when a planet in a divisional chart is related to the lagna or the lagna lord, then it does have this eligibility for bringing the event. Another principle you're going to be hearing from me about is that when two planets in a divisional chart have an exceptional condition, like Jupiter and Saturn do here, and they are connected, and there's a promise in the birth chart, well, this is a period that really comes like a flashing red light as being one that can bring this event. But again, Jupiter-Saturn is a fairly long period. I think it goes up to some point in 2021. He was talking to me in 2016 or 17, I forget exactly. It might have been, actually I forget exactly. Might have been early 2018 when he was talking about this. But I'd highlighted Jupiter-Saturn as being one that could bring this. And even then on a sub-period level, I'm looking for planets that are strongly connected to Saturn in the D4. certainly that would have been Mercury because it's involved in exchange here, but then also Venus. So as sub periods, I was focusing in on then, and was looking at 2019. But then, of course, I'm cross-checking the indication in the Gemini system, starting with the fact that he was running his major period of Aquarius. So with Aquarius here, again, the idea, as many of you know who've taken my Gemini course, use it as a logman, see what's happening on the fourth house from there, which would be Taurus. And what you see is that you're having an exalted planet there, the moon, who is the natural significator of things like homes. And it also receives the Rashi Drishti of Mars from Libra, which is the natural significator of property. So based on these factors, certainly, Aquarius seemed eligible for bringing this, but what even made it completely eligible, or eligible without a doubt, is the fact that you'll see that in the birth chart, look here, you'll see the sun is the MK, planet with the fourth highest degrees. And if I show you D4 again, you'll see that the MK goes right into Aquarius. So it was very apparent to me that Aquarius is a major period. Then it became a question of sub-periods. And the sub-periods that were coming up that I was looking at was Aquarius Leo, which certainly could have been eligible. MK is in Leo in the birth chart. Aquarius Virgo, which didn't appear to me to be eligible at first, but then some of you who know Gemini well realize that we should, in timing any event, see padas, what's called padas. The pada of a house is how many signs a lord of a house has progressed, and then progressing in an equal number of signs. So if you focus on this person's fourth house of Scorpio, the ruler is Mars. You count how far the Lord has gone forward in the zodiac, which it's gone 12 signs to Libra, and you count 12 from there, and you come to Virgo. And so Aquarius Virgo was going to be happening mid-year in 2019, and it was lining up with the Vinchotri sequence that I talked about earlier. And so then I had transits to consider. And again, I saw that Jupiter was going to be touching over Sagittarius, but it's going to come back retrograding into Scorpio, his fourth house. And then Sagittarius was going to have Saturn, but Saturn retrograde was going to be aspecting as if from the sign previous, the fourth house. So here was a situation where the things were lining up. Two dashas, one planetary based, one sign based, in transits. And actually, not to get too complex here, I won't talk about other dashas I was looking at, but bottom line was my conclusion and the input that it got from me was mid-year, approximately mid-year 2019, and he ended up purchasing a home and taking occupation in May of this year. So what I'm doing here again is introducing you to the methodology that we're going to be using over and over again when we're looking at timing the 8 events that major life events that we're going to be focused on in this course. So what are those major life events? Well, you've probably, all in the publicized, in the publication on my website about this course, you've seen this, but we're going to be focused on the major life events listed here, which to some degree follow a little bit of progression in a person's life. We start out, we have our educational years, so we're going to be looking at the event of educational success, and then normally after that, what we want to do is obtain a position and also to progress and be successful in our career, which then can give us some financial prosperity, hopefully. And you've got marriage, followed by typically childbirth. And usually there's the acquisition of the home after that, or there could be the acquisition of the home before that. But then in a totally unrelated sort of thing, something that, I've gotten a lot of questions about, astrologers get a lot of questions about, is relocation abroad. That's something we're going to be looking at. And then also maybe not a major life event for a lot of people, but for a lot of people into the Indian spiritual tradition and to Jyotish it is, and that is times when they meet a guru and become spiritually initiated. So these are the 8 events we're going to be looking at. And you'll notice that they're all favorable, positive events, kind of events that people desire to have happen. I talk about in this article here, you've been all going to get that I made a personal choice at one point not to give negative predictions, even when asked to. That was a personal choice on my part. I decided that, I'll share with you I once heard Kane Rao said that, an astrologer's karma, the karma they collect or they accumulate or they create through doing astrology is not going to be as a result of whether they give successful predictions or not, if they're making a sincere effort to do so. It's going to be what sort of influence they have on the person that is consulting with them. And I decided personally that I don't want to create fear, I don't want to create anxiety or even depression within people by giving them negative predictions. I'm always going to try to use astrology to uplift and to support wherever possible. And that's what I've attempted to do. And maybe just give an example of that to conclude here. I was recently contacted by a person who, you'll see their chart here before you now, and they're a young man who described that they were in a PhD program here in the U.S., obtaining a PhD in higher mathematics, and aspired to have a career as a professor of mathematics in institutions of higher learning, colleges, universities. In other words, he wanted a career in academia. And that he anticipated completing his dissertation and getting his PhD soon, in which case he would be getting into the job market for this. And the time frame that he gave me was, say, the end of 2019, early part of 2020, which would then be for the following academic year, which would start in the fall of 2020, September, around the September fall period of 2020. Well, it turned out to be one of these fortuitous situations where an astrologer is in a position, based on what they see in the chart, to really support and encourage someone and to kind of help give them confidence that they can realize the goal that they're shooting for. Why? You see here in his chart that the Lagna Lord is Venus, and it's placed in the 9th house of the institutions of higher learning. Not only that, but it's with the 9th Lord Mercury. And, he told me that he was a mathematician. And if you understand the correlation between certain subjects and the grahas, you would know that the sun actually pertains to, mathematics, particularly the higher forms of mathematics. And the sun is very, very strong here. It's Vargotama in the 9th house with the Lagna Lord and the 9th Lord. Of course, this combination is of the 1st, 9th, and 11th lords, so it forms some quality of Dut Nova as well. And the important thing here was that he had recently moved into his Venus Mahadasha and was currently running Venus. I saw that in the time frame when he would be putting himself on the job market, it would be Venus, Mercury. Of course, besides Dun Yogas, Venus and Mercury form Raja Yoga. So could this sequence of periods, Venus, Mercury, give him a position in academia as he aspired to? It seemed clear that it could. Now, of course, I didn't stop here. I'm not showing it, but I'm looking at the Gemini system in the same time frame and whether it indicated some sort of similar indication. I don't recall exactly the particulars, but I don't know if it was a major period or a sub-period, but he was going to be running Aquarius from where Saturn, the AMK, falls in the 10th house. And so this was rather strong confirmation that in a similar time frame, he'd be able to obtain a position. So we don't know about this prediction yet. It's still to be determined. I've asked him to let me know how things turn out. But, obviously he was very, very strongly encouraged to hear something like this. And it's kind of a position that, astrologer can really do someone some good, just telling them very sincerely, what they see. Now it remains to be seen. So lastly, the thing I want to talk about is the approach to learning how to predict life events that are going to be a part of this class. And those of you who have been a part of other classes have seen this before. It's a method of instruction, you might say, that I emulated from what I saw K.N. Rao do, whenever he taught how to predict a certain event, he would start out by just laying out what he called predictive parameters. Here's what you're looking for, right? And here's the different ways in which the event can be seen, some of which I've shown here. Then secondarily, he would then illustrate the efficacy, the effectiveness of these parameters using the charts of well-known famous personalities whose life events and the timing of these could be independently verified. But after a couple of illustrations of that, he would then, from his own case studies, case files, he would show predictions that he made using the predictive parameters he had laid out earlier, and how successful predictions that he'd made in the past based on these. And then lastly, and this was kind of sometimes the most interesting part, he would ask people in the class who had experienced a certain event, say marriage, or had children, or so on, to, if they'd be willing to share their chart, and so that the class could look at the periods and subperiods when that happened to see if they fit the predictive parameters or not. And it's kind of got the sort of the live demonstration, as it were. And he called it blind testing because, of course, he had never looked at these charts before. He didn't know in advance whether the parameters were going to fit or not. And of course, more often than not, much more often than not, they actually worked beautifully. And this made a powerful impression upon me, as it certainly did other students, when you see the predictive parameters come alive with regards to your own chart and your own life experience. And so this is the method that we're going to be using here, and I hope that people in the class would be, anonymously of course, be willing to share their birth data with me and the timing of their events, so that we can do this type of thing in the classroom. This is going to be very much a part of the live webinars. And so, last thing I want to say here, you'll see it on this document when you get it, is that my request to everyone here, when they learn about predicting major life events, is that they only use this knowledge in the spirit of service to others and in order to help others. Again, we have to think about what karma we are creating through our astrological activity, and it's going to be a result of, I believe, in what K.N. Rao said, it's going to be what impact you have on people. We are in a position, you might say, to be of help to people with such knowledge. We can also do a lot of harm. That I won't, kind of go into that much now. But I once heard K.N. Rao that no one can play the devil with a person's mind the way an astrologer can, and I certainly have experienced how that is true. And so you have to be careful both what you say to people and how you say it, and always uplift, as I've mentioned. So this is your introduction to this course, Major Life Events. The next lesson that you'll receive is an actual lesson on timing a particular event, starting with educational achievement. So until then, namaste, and I look forward to instructing you in this course. Bye for now.